go.
Is it Nigel, Jenny?
Yep, we're online now, Carolyn, ready to go. So,
Okay.
we are reading into chapter 2 today of Esther, and
Yep.
I think that's going to be an exciting read. Just open the passage up here. Oh, that's why it's
Is there norovirus going around? Does anyone know?
Haven't a clue.
Oh, right, okay.
Not in the scope of the expertise of this meeting. Right.
Just wondered if Jenny or Mandy knew. Just that our family's come down with it. I just wondered if it was going
All
around
right.
or not.
Yeah. I don't know, Carolyn, to be honest. I'm sorry to hear your family's gone down with it. But we're live on YouTube here at the minute, so probably not good to send out all family details everywhere. But there we go. So we've got Esther.
Well, they don't know my family.
Esther 2, and if we do, I think it's all the way down to 18, I think. So we're going to have a look at this today. So I don't know who would like to read and who would like to pray this morning.
I can read if you want.
Thank you, Mandy. And anyone like to pray?
Yeah, happy to pray. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Lord, for this day. Thank you for your word. Yeah, thank you as we go into your word that we'll learn more about this, what happened with King Xerxes in Persia, in his kingdom, and thank you for being with us now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Right, brilliant. Thanks, Carolyn. That was a great prayer. And welcome, Sue. Sue, we're starting into chapter 2. And Mandy's about to read the first 18 verses for us. So go for it, Mandy.
After these things, when the anger of the king Xerxes subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants attending him said, "Let them seek attractive young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint chief officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every attractive young virgin to the harem in the citadel of Susa, under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let him give them their beauty treatment, and let the young women who is pleasing in the king's eyes become queen in the place of Vashti." The thing was good in the king's eyes, and he acted accordingly. There was a Jew in the citadel of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who was deported from Jerusalem with the exiles who were deported from Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had deported. He was raising Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she did not have a father or a mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was very attractive. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had taken her as his daughter, and it happened at the proclaiming of the edict of the king and his law, when the many young women were being gathered to the citadel of Susa under Haggai's care. Esther was taken to the king's palace under the care of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. The young woman pleased him, and she won favor in his presence. And he quickly provided for her beauty treatment and for her and her portion of food, with 7 chosen maids to give to her from the king's palace. And he advanced her and her maids to the best part of the harem. Esther did not disclose her people and her family, because Mordecai had charged her that she must not tell. And every day Mordecai would walk up and down in front of the courtyard of the harem to learn how Esther was doing. When the turn came for each girl to go to King Xerxes, after the end of 12 months of being under the regulations of the women for the days of their beauty treatments had to be filled. 6 months with the oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics. In this way, the girl goes to the king, and all that she asks is given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem. Under the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, in charge of the concubines, she would not go back to the king unless the king delighted in her and she was called by name. When the turn came near for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as a daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask anything except what Haggai, the eunuch of the king, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther carried favor in the eyes of everyone that saw her. Esther was taken to King Xerxes in his palace in the 10th month, that is Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won his favor and loyalty more than all the virgins. So he put a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his officials and servants, and he granted a tax amnesty to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality.
Wow. So, we've just followed, thanks for reading that, Mandy, that's lovely way you read it, and an interesting version of the Bible. Which version were you using?
That's the Lexham English Bible.
Lexham English, okay.
Very close to the ESV.
It is very close to the ESV, but there's a couple of words difference, like I think ESV says they were taken from one place to another, and that says they were almost like exile, not quite exile. What does it say, the term?
Where Nebuchadnezzar deported,
yes. It's a very different term, but that's very, very interesting. Right, thanks, Mandy. So this story we're picking up follows a disastrous drunken feast where the king had summoned had two parties going, one for the men from all around the whole empire, and the whole thing lasted about 180 days or something, and there was a big feast with 7 days constant feasting, and everyone could drink as much as they wanted. They didn't just have to drink as much as the king. They could drink the king under the table if they wanted. And in that environment, suddenly this idea pops in his head: my wife's very beautiful, I want everyone to see her. And he summons the queen into that environment, breaking probably cultural rules, probably breaking a whole load of things. And the queen goes, no thanks, I don't really want to go and parade in front of a whole feast full of men. I'm running my own feast for all the women, so actually I'm not going to come. And the king was angry at this, and his officials all got worried because they were also very drunk. And the advice given was probably, well, actually all women could react. We could have a revolt on our hands. And so they panicked, and they looked at what should be decreed. And they decided the king would never see the queen again. And because she disgraced him, and that would be a lesson to all women everywhere. And I'm summarizing a little bit, but that seems to have been the tone set. And then we meet chapter 2. The king sobers up a bit, the king comes round a little bit, and then begins to think, wait a minute, I can't see the queen anymore. And so the royal officials come up with this scheme where they basically say, well, why don't you just, plenty more fish in the sea, mate. Actually, we're going to provide, you select any of the beautiful young ladies in the whole kingdom that you would like, and we'll get a whole selection of them together, of the most beautiful people we can find, and then from them you can select a new queen. And it sounded good to the king, and basically this was horrific. So as we look at this today, we're about to see a very abusive situation where people were taken by the king, used for a night, and then basically either discarded into the royal harem in some way, or taken as queen. And you've got this, imagine a lot of these young girls will have been promised in marriage to other people. There was whole things with families working through, and in the middle of all of that, you would have had, here's this old guy, and you could be married to him. And I think it's always painted very often in many of the ways this is told as, isn't it wonderful? She was so beautiful and she was acceptable. Yes, she was, but actually, unless we look at some of the horror behind this, now you imagine none of those girls would ever be able to get married after that. Actually, it put them into a situation of lifestyle and life that was determined by absolute belligerence coming from a drunken feast. And I'm probably painting it in a certain way, but actually it is abusive. And it is an abuse of power. And as we looked at over the last 2 days, as we looked at this, there's a massive contrast between the kingdom of God and this Persian empire, and how people should be treated and how people should be valued. And so I'll open it up there. I hope I've set the tone. I'll soon find out as the token male on this conversation, and I'll open it up. But I do think it's abusive, and I do think maybe it was a done thing by kings, but I don't think it was right. And I think that's worth saying and looking at, and all the beauty treatments. I mean, 6 months being dripped in oil. Good grief. I can't imagine anything worse. But there are people who do that to themselves with sunbathing and things like that. So I'm opening it up. So go for it.
Yeah. I think that I heard I hear a really good lady who does sermons. So this is sort of more from what I've learned through her. And that's Jill Briscoe, Telling the Truth. Really good. Recommend it. And she was saying, which I thought was appalling, was that the virgins, as they go before the king, he would decide which one he would like to marry, and basically they would spend the night with him. Probably each one, they would spend the night with each one. So whichever one he decides, that's great. But the others, it's sort of like more or less, they probably can't marry after that, which I think is unless they go into his harem, I suppose. Yeah. Which I thought was pretty appalling, really. But that's what she said anyway.
Yep.
Yeah. So find out who.
So I'm not too far off the boil then, is what you're saying, Carolyn, on this.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Carolyn.
Different culture altogether.
Yeah. No, but I mean, whatever about culture, and I think this is something worth saying. I think in some ways we've got to be very careful, because sometimes the things in our own cultures are not right in how they treat people, and we need to learn more about that sometimes, and I think that's something that is a challenge, because there are parts of the world where this wouldn't be blinked at, and actually I think some of those situations where you find this is deep in cultural practice, I think that does sometimes need challenging in how it treats people, and I think that's difficult, because how does one culture where do you decide which culture determines things? But I think the value of humanity is very important right across all cultures, and actually is found in all religions very much, there's a care for one another that's there. I think someone came up with the statement, the golden rule, which is do unto others as you have them do unto you, seems to work in many settings around the world. So I'm just sort of thinking in terms of that, but there's some key issues here. So thank you, Carolyn. And just anyone else?
I think it's worth noting that this might not have been a cultural thing anyway. It might just have been the king being the king. If you think about things from our own history, it wasn't the culture for the king to have 8 wives, but King Henry VIII did, for his own selfish thing. And there's very similar personality, really, to this. Because King Henry VIII would just bat off his wives when they didn't fulfil what he wanted them to fill.
Yeah.
And then marry a new one, and even change the whole political system and he decreed, didn't he? He decreed a Church of England. So it's a very similar situation. So I think, we can't say necessarily that this was the culture of Persia just by reading this story. This was probably just a bad king. And even if you look through the Old Testament at the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, I mean, there was a bad king followed by a good king, followed by a bad king, followed by a good king. I wouldn't like to paint the whole of Persia and every king that had ever lived through Persia as being like King Xerxes. I think, and we have seen from other kings in Babylon, which we're talking about the same area of the world, we're just talking about a different empire. I think they bestowed favour on people and stuff. So for me, I'm quite happy to take it that King Xerxes, or however you say his name, was just a bad king, really. Do not do as he did. And I think, for me, the interesting thing is how, because it doesn't say anywhere that Mordecai heard from God or anything like that. I mean, when like Joseph took Mary, he's like having dreams and stuff to do things that are against culture and that, but we don't have any of that here. And so Mordecai actually intrigues me more than possibly the king, because you've got this absolutely horrendous thing going on, and Mordecai, who is of Israel, with the God of Israel, is there saying, well, we'll have a bit of that. And I'd love to know why, because as we know, Esther came to the throne for such a time as this. But how, where's what we haven't got in Esther that we have in most other books of the Bible is people's relationship with God, and why these decisions were actually made. And I find that quite interesting, because you could make all sorts of assumptions, but clearly Mordecai thought this was the right thing for Esther, and he treated her as a daughter, and we'll find out later on that he really did treat her as a daughter. He cared a lot about her. So to put her in this situation, I guess it's a little bit like Abraham telling the kings that she's his sister. There's something going on here that we don't know about and we'll never know about, I think. And God is moving in a way that we just don't understand from reading the story in chapters 1 and chapter 2. It becomes clear later on, but where we are at the moment is just an absolute mystery as to why people have made the decisions that they've made. And poor old Vashti, I mean, I know that she probably was taken into the harem and so she was looked after, but I mean, let's hope she got on with the other women in the harem, because what a lonely life otherwise. You're the queen that the king rejected. And basically having been treated really more like a concubine than a wife. It's a very, very interesting situation, and I think there's a lot that's baffling in there.
Yeah, totally agree. So I think it might be helpful to just look through the story as a whole. So basically, I did a bit of that in the bit I did at the beginning, but I think there's something, this idea. I don't think there was choice in it. I don't think this was. I don't think it says there that Mordecai put Esther up for this. I think this is something the king's officials went through and said, there's a nice one, there's another nice one. Right, we get all. I think it was more like that. I think in a lot of settings with the kings and power balances, and just thinking about that, in a lot of settings, David, in his mistakes that he made with Bathsheba, actually, normal kings in that time wouldn't have blinked at that action. But as a man who was supposed to be after God's own heart, that was a big issue for David. And there was murder in it and a whole load of other things. But where you've got absolute power and absolute, you can do whatever you like, there's a sense of how that tests the very fibre of human beings to the core. And I think in situations where there's power imbalance, you find a lot of abusive situations happen. And here we've got a situation with a king who has the power to demand anyone he wants. And he's encouraged by law, by the officials, to do that. And actually, I think there's a sense there where I'm not sure how much was down to a family to decide. It's more down to a family to think, can we say no to the king like Vashti did? I'm not sure we can in this situation. We don't want to make a bad situation worse. So in some ways, there is Mordecai being carried into slavery, into captivity with the Babylonians, and he's still there under the Persians. And you've got this sense where status-wise, can he stand up against anything? You look at a lot of the people being brought in, coming into this country as immigrants, and joining the UK. A lot of them, when they start, are in a very vulnerable position, power-wise, linkage-wise, knowing how society works, all those things. And eventually, that a lot of people learn and move on. But having moved countries myself, I know what that feels like. And you feel quite vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, I don't think you have the status to stand up and say, well, no, you can't have my daughter, well, adopted daughter. No, you can't. I don't think you can say no to this. And that's how I see it. But I'm open to discovering otherwise. But I think there's a power imbalance here. This is absolute power saying this is what's happening. And it's rotten, and it's sick, and it's rotten to the core. But hey, we've got the power to do it. And I think sometimes when governments do that, there's very often not great fruit from it. When it just rides roughshod over where people are. But in a huge empire, the temptation to do that's huge. So I think this, so go for it, Jenny.
I was just thinking, the people that suggested this to the king had a lot to do with it, because obviously he must have been a bit weak because he just listened to them all the time and did what they said, because he said afterwards that he realised what he'd done the next day. So obviously he couldn't back down because of his honour and also pride. So I think, the other people, his attendants, proposed let search be made for beautiful young women. And so he went along with it. I'm not saying obviously he was responsible, but it seems to me he was a bit of a puppet, really, because he just didn't make the decisions on his own, did he?
No.
And he didn't obviously ask God because he didn't know God. So so he just went along with what they said. And I think, even we can do that if we're not careful, can't we? I know you have, you should take advice from people, but in the end, you have to make the decision yourself on different things.
Yeah. I think, thanks, Jenny. Have you finished? Just
I think so, yeah. He does say that it pleased him to go, I've got to find it now. This advice appealed to the king. We probably would, wouldn't it? and so he followed it. So yeah, I don't know. I think probably that culture probably did do that, because you hear of harems a lot, don't you? Harems,
Yeah.
harems.
And actually, that was part of the strategy of holding power. So if you married a lot of different kingdoms, princesses, you actually build a base of connectivity between those by marriage. So there's some of that. So in actual fact, it was also a political tool. But in this case, hey, sorry, dog's going a bit crazy. People are bashing. Wait a minute. Sorry, we just had a situation where we had people checking something out with the shed, so I'm just checking that. But basically, you've got this kind of So marriage was a political game as well as other things. But in this case, it seems to have been sexual gratification. To be honest, none of these people were powerful people. Were dynamic queens potentially necessarily. He wasn't treating other nations like this. He was treating his own nation like this, and his own empire like this, and so it's a very different thing. I'd say in comparison with a normal situation. I think also I think the king really is in a very busy situation, but that kind of advisors that advise. We've got government advisors now, civil servants who do loads of things in our government, and actually I think they do a lot of the work that actually happens. I know people do read lots of papers and make lots of decisions, but behind them is this whole strata of advisors, a whole strata of people making the work get done. And as someone said to me, if you knew the people in charge of governments and things like that, and this is someone who had some knowledge, said you wouldn't ask those people to build your garden shed in some ways, because they need the practical people underneath to make it all happen. It's actually them in isolation are not they might make decisions and they might have political things and be able to play brilliant ability to run government and do those things from one position. But at the same time, a lot of the work and the advice and so on comes from these advisors. And also, there's just the king is always one stage removed from that decision making. So, in the first place, what shall I do about Vashti? What does the law say I have to do about this woman that's made me very, very angry in my drunken state? And actually, every stage, the king is slightly removed from the decision, and it's actually the decision of his advisors, and this pleased the king, but it was a decision of his advisors, you see. And so that's how, like, someone who's a statesman or someone at the top of something very often makes decisions. It's not actually their decision, it's actually the decision that's been reached by consensus, or been reached by advice, or been reached by those kind of things. I think has a lot to do with it. So I don't know if I'm painting the right picture, but I think that's maybe something in that in this situation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Nigel. And I think that it's also worth noting that a lot of these advisors would be jostling for position as well in their advice. I mean, I think if you take any large organisation, it doesn't even have to be government, any large organisation, whether it be a corporation or public service, very often you'll talk to people who have what would be the lower paid jobs, and they're lovely individuals working very hard who want to fulfil the aims of the organisation and do a good job, and then you'll get the people at the top who'll want to take care of those people doing the job, and they're very much behind them and support them. But somewhere in the middle, there's kind of some middle and upper middle management who actually are jostling for a promotion, and suddenly the information that comes from the lower paid workers to the top of the organisation actually isn't what has really happened, and the people who take the credit are not necessarily the people who should be taking the credit, and there's all these things going on, and this would have been happening here. I've got absolutely no doubt that this would have been happening here, that you've got this whole group of men who are probably bickering with each other on a daily basis, trying to pull the rug out from underneath each other so the king notices them. And that sort of behaviour certainly comes to the forefront later on in this book, to quite a large degree. And so I think with the king, it might have even been which one of his wise men he liked the most as to who he listened to, or who was up for the next promotion that he listened to. But like Jenny said, I mean, to me, he is just a puppet, isn't he? He does pretty much what he's told, and doesn't seem to question it. He just like, yeah, I quite like that idea. I don't know how old he is. He comes across like a very young teenager who
Could have
just discovered girls, and he doesn't know. He's not really quite sure what to do, so asks all his mates.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just going on to some lessons we can learn from this, and we haven't got the whole way through this, but we've just looked at the king basically and this terrible decision, and we haven't got too far. We've hinted at Mordecai and a few things, but we haven't got much further. But I'll just say, learning a lesson from this: when you're in a position of power, when you're in a position where you can do things and get away with it, what do you do? That's the challenge of your integrity. What you are like when no one else sees is a challenge to our integrity. And that's difficult, because we've all got flaws, we've all got things, but actually in all of that, this is the challenge. In the king, it's public and out loud and all out there, but for all of us, it's that walk daily, it's that walk hourly, it's that breaking of temptation, breaking of habit, all those kind of things that where the challenge is there. But also when you're in the position or you're in a place, how do you act right? How do you do what's right? And all of that. How do you use your power or your influence to lift up others rather than lift up yourself? I think it's a New Testament thing of that. I think the any sense of privilege that any of us have should be used to build up others. It should be to enable other voices to be heard. It can be used to shape things, yes, but actually I think in how it hits others, it shouldn't be used abusively of others. It should be used in a way that builds others up. And I think that's really important. It's all gone quiet. The tumbleweed rolls through the room. Right, so have we done with the king and his bad behavior so far? Shall we move on to Mordecai and Esther and just have a look at that?
I missed that last bit because I lost reception, sorry.
No worries, Carolyn. What did you want to say?
Sorry, no. It's okay, don't worry.
All right, you had your hand up. Sorry, I was following the hand. There we go. That's no worries. Okay, let's move. Go
Sorry,
for it,
Nigel. I was just going to say, we haven't actually mentioned Haggai, have we, the eunuch?
No,
in charge of all the women. And I think for him, what a job. You know, he's basically a slave if he's a eunuch. So he has no life of his own. And he's stuck in the... certainly the places I've been to where I've looked at where we've been around historical palaces and stuff, where the harems were, they live in the top of the building, so they're out of the way. And they put all those screens around with the little holes in that you see on the movies, so that no one can actually see the women. And he's living up there with them. I mean, goodness knows how many there were of them, but I kind of feel sorry for him a little bit. He's got no male company, and all these bitter women who have been used by the king, surrounded by him, and yet we read how much he takes care of them.
Yeah.
The compassion that he has for them. And I quite like Haggai. And I think it's worth a note.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but as the only male in this conversation, I also feel sorry for him because of what had to happen to him for him to get that job, and it was abusive. They would have basically chosen him. Yeah, he'll be the guy who'll be king's eunuch. Right, let's chop off some bits, and that would have been him done. That's what makes someone a eunuch. So yeah.
Yeah, not good.
Wonderful guy to come through that tragedy and be on the other side of it and still be servant-hearted. So I'll just add that bit, which is the bit that makes me flinch. But I'm glad Mandy brought it up because I was rushing over that bit.
Goes as a lesson. That's funny.
But he'd have had status, he'd have had power, he'd have had influence, but at the same time he did it in a servant-hearted way, which is
amazing.
Is very interesting.
It's interesting. Lots, wow. Wow.
Carolyn, I see your waving hand there.
Yeah, but I think also, I'm not being cynical, but also because it's his job, you kind of wouldn't have a choice, really, would you? You kind of have to do the best that you could do, because you wouldn't want to be like sacked by the king, really. So yeah, I'm not saying that he doesn't do it well, but I'm just saying you're put in that post, and I think you've got to do the best that you can do, haven't you, for your own life as well. I think your own life safety almost. Considering what he's like. His position,
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, and I think that's right. You imagine, you treat the Queen badly, and the Queen goes in and spends the night with the King. Are you going to come out with your head on your shoulders or not? So I think there's a balance there, and I think you're putting the counterbalance in very well, Carolyn. So thanks for that. So shall we move on to Mordecai? And have a look at that. We might not get through all of this today, but I think it's interesting. So about verse 5, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So he was with the king. Is an interesting statement. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And I think that sort of 5 to 7 bit, showing a little bit of what Mordecai was like. I know in some of the things I've been in touch with people about in other nations over this COVID time, there are situations like this where a mother and father die, but there isn't the tender care of Mordecai that takes place. And I have to say there is some horrific examples of this in the world, but here you've got Mordecai, a shining example, who took her as his daughter and looked after her like a daughter and gave her advice. And Mordecai's advice, you just don't know what his role was before captivity, but it seems there's some linkage with the king. He knows how royal things are done, he knows protocol, he knows the language, he knows how things work in royal situations. I think that's a very interesting setup. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. Carolyn?
Oh no, no, I won't. No, I'll just come back
Okay.
to
Okay,
that.
that's fine.
What the
I'll
other
drop
bit
your
in a
hand then.
second.
Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant. Thanks, Carolyn.
Haggai. I'll ask it about Haggai in a minute after you've done that. Yeah,
Okay. Did you want to say we've already done? Did we do Haggai? I think he was a. Um, oh no, he's the next one. Yeah, it's further on. That's fine. We'll do that in a bit, Carolyn. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyone else like to comment on Mordecai? Have we got him summed up? Have we got? Is there anything more we need to say about Mordecai? Okay. We'll
It does
move on.
make it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So go, Jenny.
it does make you wonder if Mordecai was in touch with God, though, because it seems like he's almost a step ahead, doesn't it? Because he's sort of, he's trying to protect her, but he knows that she's got to go through that process. It does make me think that Mordecai may have heard from the Lord anyway. Doesn't say that, but God obviously used him greatly, didn't he? So
Yeah.
you don't know, do you? Because sometimes God leads you and you're not always aware of it, I think. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this is the whole thing with Esther. I'm glad you did that, Jenny, because the whole thing with Esther, that God's not mentioned, but you can see
That's right.
God's purposes playing out, and you can see what's happening, and you can see how even in tragedy, and difficulty and negative things happening, God is still large and in charge, in my view, and actually there are things happening, even in the worst of situations sometimes. Thank you, Jenny. Carolyn?
Yeah, no, if you don't mind, so if I just ask about Haggai again, quickly? Is that all right?
We'll
Or do you want me to wait? Yeah?
unless Mandy's got something on Mordecai.
Yeah.
Have you got something on Mordecai, Mandy?
Okay.
Yeah. Go for it first, Mandy, and then we'll go to
Yeah,
Carolyn.
I was just thinking with Mordecai. I mean, God knew that this story was going to go down through history, didn't he?
Yeah.
And Esther wouldn't have been able to be the storyteller in her own right because she was a woman. People wouldn't have listened to her in the same way. So I think it's interesting with Mordecai because it's like God has chosen the storyteller. Whose eyes, who has close enough for this story to go through history, accurate enough for it to be put in the Bible? And God chose Mordecai to do that. Yeah. And I think as much as we talk about Esther being chosen by God, so was Mordecai. Because I think if Mordecai was not as important as that, Esther would not have gone to live with him. And I think I think there has to have been some sort of good relationship between Mordecai and God, because otherwise God would never have chosen him to do that in the first place.
Yeah. Thanks, Mandy. I've put something up on the YouTube site, which but it's about the authorship of Esther, which I didn't mention when we started the book, but it says in the notes in the ESV, it's possible that the author was someone like Mordecai, who had access to such material and had a keen interest in Jewish affairs. His familiarity with Persian customs of the time suggests he lived not long after the events described. And so in there's sort of guesses about the who wrote this. So when you're saying who was trusted with the responsibility for writing this down under the power of the Holy Spirit, one of the suggestions is it could be Mordecai, or someone who knew the stuff that happened fairly well in detail. And also when you think someone becomes queen, then there's books written, there's in our culture there's that kind of thing. Actually in this culture, there's a lot of people who get to know the story and get to know what's happening and love the stories, so I think there's a lot in that of who wrote the book is an interesting one. So thanks, Mandy. And Carolyn, go for it. You're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering, so is Haggai like a Jewish person? Is Haggai a Jewish name?
I don't know. I don't think so.
No. No. Okay. Yeah, so I just wondered why. So he basically favoured Esther, that was all. So I just wondered.
Yeah, there is a Haggai. That's where I'm going to suck on it. Haggai book in the Bible, isn't there? The book of Haggai.
Yeah.
And that was a prophetic name, but you notice the spelling's totally different in this.
Okay.
But also, a lot of these languages, there may have been some overlap, so you don't know. It may have had a similar meaning, but just be in a different language.
Yeah, and he wouldn't have known. Yeah, he wouldn't have known that.
But I imagine. Yeah, but it's amazing how people, who have something about them stand out and get noticed. Daniel was able to say to the guy, "Look, can I just have veggies? I don't want any meat," and all of that before the king. And he had favor. The guy saying, "Are you putting my head on the block? I could be killed for you having the wrong diet." And Daniel says, "No, give us a shot, test it out, and you'll find." And he blagged his way through to that. And actually, you find in lots of these situations, there's almost a blag ability. I don't know if they were Irish or not. No, they weren't Irish, but there's a blag ability that they're able to have, where they're able to say something into those situations and win some favour. And Kitty, I'm strongly Irish today, along with that comment. But I think that they'd kiss, I think they'd kissed the Blarney Stone. Is the phrase? Is that right?
Indeed. Kiss the gab.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Kitty. So moving on. So we've got the situation of Mordecai, who is honourable, who has taken this beautiful girl, who is a relatives with all orphan, and he's taken her under his care. He's looking after her, treating her just like a daughter, and actually honouring her and wanting to see her flourish. And I think that, in comparison with how the king handles his position and his power, Mordecai's way of handling it is absolutely with integrity and beauty. I think it's great. Did you want to? So we've asked the question about Haggai. So we've already discussed him a little bit and how he served really well, and I think there's some of those things there. So we've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just thinking, just looking at this, we could look a little bit at. I don't know if this is something you guys are up for, but looking at what the process that Esther went through. And actually was going into, and the length of time and things like that. So I'm sort of thinking the young right. So she was taken into the care of Haggai, and Esther was taken into the king's palace, put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the woman. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics. With her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and the young woman to the best place in the harem. So actually, he was working on a pecking order there. Just like Mandy was saying, a lot of government officials manipulate things and fight. He was positioning people in certain places of honour, and places they could be noticed.
I thought it was more. Yeah, I think it is because I was got it mixed up, and I thought it did sound sort of quite a Jewish name, but he wouldn't have necessarily known that Esther was a Jewess anyway. So I think that was not really relevant, right?
Yeah, and that was all hidden, so no one knew she was from a Jewish background.
Only Mordecai, wasn't it?
All of that was hidden, and this story is a story of anti-Semitism in a very cruel way as well. And so a lot of the celebration of Purim actually is about these kind of stories which have occurred throughout Jewish history, and have been attempt after attempt to wipe them out. And so we're going there with the story.
Yeah.
But so I don't think he would have
Don't
known
worry.
she was Jewish, and Mordecai had advised her to stay quiet about that, which many people do sometimes, keep quiet about their background and things like that.
So when
even-
she makes
even
him
now.
even more brave in a way, because
Yeah.
the king wasn't even aware of her background, so she was very brave,
Yeah.
wasn't she?
So I think what's important here is he provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and a good position in the harem, right? So her portion of food, actually, this is going to take some months. Her diet is important in how things turn out, and and so making sure she's got food. I don't know. There's a lot of things that have gone into the thought behind this, but 6 months. I mean, how? I mean, this is just incredibly weird. Beautifying 6 months with the oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments. So is this a 12-month process of preparation? And then a night with the king.
Yeah, it's a lot to hang on, isn't it?
Yeah, go for it, Jenny.
I always think this is like we go through with the Holy Spirit works in us, doesn't he? And he purifies us with the oil of joy and the oil, he purifies us through pouring his love on us. And it was about the oil of myrrh. And myrrh was, used in death, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In dead bodies and things. So in a way, we have to die to ourselves. God, helps us go through a process of purification, really, because although he's made us pure through the blood, he still keeps working in our lives. He doesn't just stop. We're going from glory to glory. And, this is like a process that we go through. And it's not quick, because it says it took a long time, because it takes time, because we sometimes fight against it, sometimes we don't always do what God wants. And I think it's like our lives, really. God is purifying us every day and pouring out his Spirit on us, and getting us ready to be part of his bride. And I think this is like an analogy of that. So, preparing us as a bride for him, for Jesus. So I always think that's how it means to me, anyway. Because we have to look at this and see what it means to us today too, don't we, really? It's not just a history lesson, is it?
No.
It's what it means to us today. So we need to ask God, what are you saying to me through this?
Yeah.
'Cause I know he's...
Yeah. Go on, Jenny. Sorry.
No, so I know he's doing that with me, because it's not always easy, and that we have to submit to him, as Esther submitted to I've forgotten his name now, Haggai. She had to allow herself to be beautified, and that must have been so hard, But we've got Jesus to look forward to. We've got heaven to look forward to. I mean, she didn't know what was going to happen, did she? But she must have really trusted in God to because she didn't know what was ahead of her. But because she did everything in a right manner, she received the crown, didn't she? Like, we don't always do that. And because of the blood of Jesus, we're made whole anyway. So, but we still go through that process, I believe. So it's just submitting, really.
Yeah. So I'm taking what you're saying, Jenny, but what I'm thinking is, so if this is a horrible kingdom, this Persian kingdom, with a lot of cruelty in it, and they were known for their cruelty. Okay, that was one of the things they're famous for. famous for capturing people, bringing them into their thing, and then slaughtering them by cruel methods. So there was things like that in their history. No, it's not a history lesson, but there's things like that with this empire that are really cruel and not very nice. Yet Esther submitted to that. When it comes to the kingdom of God, which is a total contrast to that kingdom, our attitude, as you're saying, needs to be submit to God and let Him beautify us. Let Him bring the nature of Jesus into us, the fragrance of Jesus into us, in all of His goodness, all of His good glory, all of His wonderfulness flowing through us, and soaking into us and immersing us. And that's the contrast between the kingdom of God and this. But we can look at this and it can spark us to think, well, if that's how it is in that kingdom, how should it be in the kingdom of God? And actually we've got great things to look forward to. These guys didn't have all that great things. You're in position until you do the Vashti, basically. That's different in the kingdom of God. There's a love, there's a joy, there's an acceptance, there's not rejection, there's all these things that are totally different. Thank you, Jenny. That's a beautiful point to bring up. Thank you. Carolyn?
I was just thinking how well that Mordecai must have taught her in that case, after what Jenny said, that he must have been a good teacher, and he must have shared his faith, and just sort of like kind of brought the gospel in a way through the Old Testament methods, and also I wonder if. Do you think that? It's just a question. Do you think that Esther had much choice, or do you think that she agreed with it with Mordecai to do this? I'm not sure. Do you think she was being subservient to Mordecai, or I don't know.
I think.
Don't know what her position was really.
I think once again, a brilliant point. So not only was Mordecai good towards Esther would listen to Mordecai the whole way through. There was an honouring like he was her dad.
That's right.
And there was a caring for her like she was a daughter.
That's
it. But actually, in a lot of these big, powerful games with the politics of what was happening in the Persian Empire and the king, I don't think anyone had too much say. It wasn't like Parliament, where Parliament holds power, but we've got the Queen. And there's sort of a deal done there, going all the way back to Oliver Cromwell and stuff, where the power of the king was never the power of the king as it was before, and so there's some of those kind of things that have happened in our English, British, things, but actually in this you had an all-powerful king. There was no parliament to advise. I mean, he could ask for advice, but basically if he said your head comes off, your head comes off. And so I don't think there was much say that was there for Esther. But actually, I think in the way she approached things, sometimes when you're in situations where you're not empowered to make decisions, when you're not empowered to make choices, where you're not empowered to do those things, and you have the right attitude of heart, you can open doors that no one else could open. And I think this is what we see with Esther, is even though she was in a disempowered position, actually what she did with the position she was in, so you can almost mirror this along with Joseph. Joseph was thrown in prison, rose to the top of that. He was made a slave, rose to the top of that. In prison, rose to the top of that. Every stage he was tested and rose to the top. Here you find with Esther, she's chosen, thrown into the king's harem, comes to the top, gets chosen as one of the people to spend a night with the king, rises to the top, and becomes queen. And actually, in the next situation, she's disempowered because her people are going to be killed, and she rises to the top again. And it's just some of that just breaks through and breaks through and breaks through. And I think very often our attitude to things where we're disempowered is some important lessons we can learn there as well. So thank you, Carolyn. Mandy?
That's okay.
I think this lessons here, isn't there, about spiritual covering as well, and authority, spiritual authority. I think she could have been enough teenager and turn around to Mordecai and go, "You're not my dad," but she would have had no protection and no covering if she had done that. And I think it brings us back down to the way God intends things in families, in communities, and doing stuff together, and having spiritual authorities in churches and in families and stuff, because in that there is protection, because the ultimate authority is God. And here in Israel, the ultimate authority over Israel, even though they were in exile, was God. And so submitting herself to the authority of Mordecai and the fatherhood, I think that's more important, the fatherhood of Mordecai, she gets that protection, and she's not alone in the harem. And I think, there's a question here over food again, isn't there, like there was in the New Testament with Peter and all the arguments Paul had about whether food was unclean or not. She's got that here. Someone else is in charge of her food. But if she says, well, actually, I'm a Jew and I don't eat certain types of meat and some things are unclean to me, she puts herself in danger. And so she's submitted to that fatherhood of Mordecai, who has protected her and said, don't tell them come from. Just get on with it. It'll be okay in the end. I'm looking out for you. And I think the other thing that really jumps out at me is the favour of Haggai towards her in her harem. She already had the place of honour as a queen before she became queen. Haggai had already picked her up. She was at the top of the harem. She was the most special. He actually submitted to her in a sense by looking after her. And you can almost see it going through Haggai's mind, thinking, well, whoever becomes queen becomes my boss. Who do I want to be my boss? And actually, I like Esther. She's a nice one. I'm gonna look after her, because if she becomes queen, she'll look after me.
Smart, Mandy.
I hadn't thought of that.
That is so clever, and I I think there is a tremendous power in serving, and I think that's really interesting. Oh, I've never seen that like that, Mandy. Thank you for that. But I think if you think about it like this, okay, in a way, some very controlling settings, where a guy seems very domineering in I'm the man, and all that kind of thing. Actually, you notice the wives sometimes do all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the clothes, all the things, and that bloke can't even walk out the door of the house with his suit on without his wife. So and actually he can't even eat a meal or prepare a meal for himself without her sorting. And there's incredible power in that, because if he messes with that too much and she says, right, you're not getting any supper tonight, he's then got to find another way of having supper. And if he then can't even dress himself for work because his shirt's not ready, or what can't find his underpants or whatever, he's stuck. And actually, there's incredible power games back in some of these things. But there's incredible power in serving. I'd say I'm making a light of that, but incredible power in serving. And actually, it's an incredibly good thing. But it's not just a flash in the pan. It's not just to be seen. I think this guy Haggai, as he looked, he goes, actually, there's a consistency of quality, of character, and beauty combined. This is the right person for the king. And so he's positioned everything. He's actually chosen who the queen is, but he's chosen it for his own benefit. I love that, Mandy. It's just so rich, you know.
Yeah.
He's chosen it. He's not unselfish, this chap. He's not just nice, you know. He's nice to himself too. Oh, that's very good. Yeah. So I think it's been a great discussion. I think we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up just that last bit of Esther, and you know,
Joe.
you know, you sort of think there's a lot to flow on from this, but I'm thoroughly enjoying looking at this with you guys. It's great fun, learning loads. Thank you, and God bless. And I'll move us slowly off here, so I'll just mute some mics.